Dog waited 4 years, then something unbelievable happened. The town of Willowbrook was a quiet place, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and change came as slowly as the river that wound through its heart. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, it was a picturesque town where life moved at a steady, predictable pace. Yet for 4 years, there had been one sight that never changed: a golden retriever sitting in front of an abandoned house waiting. No one knew exactly when Buddy had first appeared, but he had been there for as long as anyone could remember, his golden fur turning dull with time, his once bright eyes filled with unwavering patience. Some said he had once belonged to the Thompson family, the last residents of the house before it had fallen into disrepair. Others speculated that he had been abandoned, left to fend for himself by someone who had long since forgotten him. But despite the endless rumors and theories, one thing remained clear: Buddy never left. Through scorching summers, drenching rains, and bitterly cold winters, he stayed, watching the road as if expecting someone to return for him. People had tried to help. Mrs. Callahan, the elderly woman who ran the town's bakery, often left out bowls of food and water. The Jensen brothers, who owned the hardware store, had once attempted to take him home, but Buddy had slipped away the moment they opened their door. The local vet, Dr. Meadows, had even examined him from a distance, noting that while he was a bit underweight, he was otherwise healthy, a testament to his resilience and the kindness of the townspeople. But no matter what anyone did, Buddy refused to be moved. The abandoned house had become his world, its broken windows and peeling paint a silent witness to his loyalty. Emma Carter had noticed Buddy ever since she was a child. Now 14, she found herself drawn to the silent dog more than ever. Where others saw an old stubborn pet clinging to the past, she saw something deeper, something that called to her in a way she couldn't explain. Each afternoon after school, she would walk past the house, slowing just enough to observe him. His ears would twitch at the sound of her footsteps, but he never turned to look at her. He simply waited. One day, unable to resist any longer, Emma stopped a few feet away from him, crouching down on the sidewalk. "Hey, Buddy," she said softly, the name coming naturally, as if it had always belonged to him. His tail gave the faintest wag, but he remained still, his gaze fixed on the empty road. Emma returned the next day and the next. She brought a peanut butter sandwich, setting it down near him before stepping back. He sniffed the air but didn't move until she had walked a good distance away. Only then did he approach the food, eating slowly, as if savoring every bite. Day by day, a quiet friendship formed. Emma never forced him to move or tried to take him home. She simply sat nearby, reading aloud from her books or talking about her day. Over time, Buddy began to trust her, inching closer, letting her sit just a little nearer than before. Then one chilly autumn afternoon, something changed. Emma was reading on the curb when Buddy, without warning, stood up and walked toward her. Her breath caught as he lowered himself beside her, resting his head on her lap. His fur was rough beneath her fingers as she hesitantly stroked his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In that moment, she knew. Buddy wasn't just waiting, he was holding on to something, something that tied him to the past, to the family he had lost. And Emma, for the first time, realized she needed to find out what that was. The next morning, she approached Mrs. Callahan at the bakery, watching as the elderly woman kneaded dough with practiced hands. "Mrs. Callahan, do you remember the Thompsons?" Emma asked. The woman's movements stilled for a moment before she sighed. "Of course, dear. They were good people. Lived in that house on Maple Street before—" She trailed off, wiping her hands on her apron. "Before what?" Emma pressed gently. Mrs. Callahan hesitated before answering. "There was an accident, a car crash. It was terrible. They moved away afterward. I don't know where." Emma's heart pounded as she left the bakery. The pieces were falling into place, but she needed more. She visited the town library, searching old newspaper archives with the help of Mr. Franklin, the town's librarian. Sure enough, she found the article. A tragic accident had left the Thompsons badly injured. Unable to care for themselves, they had relocated to be closer to family. But nowhere in the report did it mention a dog. Had they assumed Buddy wouldn't survive? Had they been forced to leave him behind? The thought made Emma's chest ache. That night, she sat beside Buddy, watching the way he still looked down the road with quiet hope. "They didn't forget you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if that was true. Emma couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Buddy sitting in front of the old Thompson house waiting. She had always believed that dogs lived in the present, content with whatever love and care they received at the moment. But Buddy was different. He wasn't just surviving. He was holding on to something deeper, something unbreakable. The knowledge settled in her chest like a weight. He wasn't staying out of habit. He was staying because his heart refused to move on. And that meant Emma couldn't move on either, not until she found out what had happened to the Thompsons. The next morning, she woke up determined. She ate breakfast quickly, barely tasting her toast, and rushed to the library before school. Mr. Franklin was already there, adjusting his reading glasses as he stacked books onto a cart. He glanced up when Emma walked in, surprised to see her so early. "Back again so soon?" he asked with a kind smile. Emma nodded, setting her bag down on one of the wooden tables. "I need to find out where the Thompsons went after the accident," she said. "I know they moved away, but I don't know where." Mr. Franklin's expression softened. He had lived in Willowbrook his entire life and had watched the town change over the decades. He had also seen Buddy waiting in front of that house for years. "I remember when it happened," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "It was a bad crash. A truck ran a red light and hit their car on the highway. They all survived, but it wasn't easy. They were in and out of the hospital for months. When they finally recovered enough to leave, they packed up quietly and went away. People said they needed a fresh start." Emma's heart ached at the thought. "Do you know where they went?" she asked. Mr. Franklin frowned, tapping his fingers on the table. "I don't, but wait a moment." He stood up and walked toward a cabinet in the corner, rummaging through old town records. After a few minutes, he pulled out a worn leather binder and flipped through its pages. Finally, he stopped. "Here we go," he murmured, squinting at the text. "After the accident, the Thompsons sold the house to a real estate company, but they left a forwarding address for legal documents." He turned the binder around so Emma could see. "Look, Greenville." Emma's eyes widened. Greenville was 2 towns over, about an hour's drive away. It wasn't that far, but far enough that no one in Willowbrook had heard from the Thompsons in years. She quickly copied down the address in her notebook, thanking Mr. Franklin profusely before hurrying off to school. She could barely focus in class, her mind racing with possibilities. What if the Thompsons had forgotten Buddy? What if they had assumed he had run away after they left? Or worse, what if they didn't want him anymore? The thought made her stomach twist, but she pushed it aside. She wouldn't know the truth until she found them. That afternoon, Emma sat beside Buddy as he lay, curled up in front of the abandoned house. She ran her fingers through his thick fur, watching as he sighed deeply, his body relaxing under her touch. "I found them, Buddy," she whispered. "They're in Greenville." Buddy's ears twitched, but he didn't move. "I don't know if they'll come back," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I have to try." She spent the next few days trying to figure out how to get to Greenville. Her parents were protective, and she knew they wouldn't let her go alone. After much debate, she finally told her mom about Buddy's story, about the waiting, the accident, and the address she had found. To her surprise, her mother listened intently, her usual strict expression softening. "You really care about this dog, don't you?" she asked. Emma nodded. "More than anything," she said honestly. Her mother sighed, shaking her head with a small smile. "All right, we'll go this weekend. But if the Thompsons don't want him anymore, you have to be prepared for that." Emma swallowed hard. She had thought about that, of course, but she wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. Saturday morning arrived cold and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Emma sat in the passenger seat of her mom's car, gripping the notebook with the Thompsons' address like a lifeline. The drive felt endless, her nerves growing with each passing mile. When they finally pulled into Greenville, she was struck by how different it was from Willowbrook. It was busier, filled with tall brick buildings and bustling streets. The house they were looking for was in a quiet neighborhood, a modest 2-story home with a well-kept lawn and flower pots lining the porch. Emma's heart pounded as she climbed out of the car. Her mom gave her an encouraging nod, staying back as Emma stepped onto the porch and rang the doorbell. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and graying hair. She looked at Emma with curiosity, then at the car parked on the curb. "Can I help you?" she asked. Emma swallowed, suddenly feeling incredibly small. "Are you Mrs. Thompson?" she asked hesitantly. The woman's brows furrowed, but she nodded. "Yes, and you are." Emma took a deep breath. "My name is Emma Carter. I'm from Willowbrook. I I came to ask you about your dog, Buddy." For a long moment, Mrs. Thompson just stared at her. Then slowly her expression changed. Her lips parted, her eyes widening in shock. "Buddy?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded. "He's still there," she said softly. "He's been waiting for you. For 4 years." Mrs. Thompson's hand flew to her mouth, her breath hitching. "Oh my God," she murmured. "Oh my God, I thought—" She turned suddenly, calling into the house. "David! David, come here!" A man appeared in the doorway, his face lined with years of quiet grief. "What is it?" he asked, concern in his voice. But when his wife turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears, he looked at Emma, then back at her, and something unspoken passed between them. "It's about Buddy," she whispered. David's face paled. He blinked rapidly, as if struggling to understand. "Buddy?" he echoed. "But how?" Emma felt tears prick at her own eyes. "He never left," she said, her voice shaking. "He's been waiting outside your old house this whole time. He never stopped looking for you." Silence filled the space between them, thick with emotion. Then suddenly Mrs. Thompson let out a small sob, covering her face with her hands. David reached for her, his grip tight as if grounding himself. Emma stood frozen, unsure of what to say, but she didn't have to. She could see it in their eyes. The disbelief, the sorrow, the love they had once thought lost forever. Finally, after a long moment, Mrs. Thompson wiped her tears, looking at Emma with something that could only be described as fierce determination. "Take us to him," she said. Emma nodded, her heart swelling with hope. The drive back to Willowbrook felt different. The weight of 4 years of silence, of waiting, of unanswered questions sat heavy in the car, thick like the air before a storm. Emma kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching Mr. and Mrs. Thompson in the back seat. They barely spoke. Mrs. Thompson clutched her hands together in her lap, her knuckles white, while Mr. Thompson stared out the window, his eyes distant, lost in the past. Emma's mother kept her focus on the road, occasionally glancing at Emma, her expression unreadable. The hum of the tires against the pavement was the only sound, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of Emma's heart. She wanted to ask them so many things. Why hadn't they come back? Did they ever think of Buddy? Did they believe he had run away? Or had they simply tried to move on, leaving behind everything that reminded them of their old life? But she couldn't bring herself to speak, afraid that asking would shatter the fragile thread of hope holding them together. Willowbrook came into view sooner than she expected, the small town looking even quieter than usual under the dull gray sky. As they turned onto Maple Street, Emma's stomach clenched. Buddy would be there. He was always there. And even though she had played this moment over in her mind 100 times, she had no idea what would happen. Would he recognize them? Would he run to them? Or had time built a wall between them that even love couldn't break? The car rolled to a stop in front of the abandoned house. Emma's breath caught as she spotted the familiar golden shape curled up on the porch, his tail resting still against the wooden floor. He looked peaceful, as if the years of waiting had finally quieted into something almost dreamlike. But the moment the car door clicked open, his ears twitched, his head lifted, his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, locked onto them. He didn't move at first. It was as if he was afraid to hope, afraid that this was just another passerby, another fleeting kindness that would leave him just as alone as before. Mrs. Thompson let out a soft, broken gasp. "Buddy!" she whispered, her voice trembling. The sound of her voice was like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. Buddy's ears perked, his body tensing, and then he moved. Slowly at first, as if he wasn't sure he could trust his own senses. Then faster, a sudden burst of energy igniting in his limbs, sending him barreling down the steps, his paws thudding against the dirt path, as he raced toward them. Mrs. Thompson barely had time to open her arms before Buddy crashed into her, knocking her backward onto the grass. She let out a sob, wrapping her arms around him as if she was afraid to let go. "Oh, my boy," she cried, her fingers tangling in his fur. "Oh, my sweet boy, I'm so sorry." Buddy whined, burying his face against her, his tail wagging wildly, his whole body shaking with the force of his emotions. Mr. Thompson knelt beside them, his hands trembling as he reached out, stroking Buddy's back, his own eyes wet with unshed tears. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. We thought we lost you." Buddy turned to him, licking his face, pressing his head against his chest as if to say, "I never left. I never stopped waiting for you." Emma stood frozen, her throat tight, tears stinging her eyes. She had imagined this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw, overwhelming power of it. The years apart, the silence, the loneliness. It all melted away in an instant, replaced by something stronger. Love, the kind that time couldn't erase, the kind that distance couldn't diminish. The townspeople had started to gather, drawn by the sight of the reunion. Mrs. Callahan stood on the bakery steps, her flour-dusted hands pressed to her mouth, while the Jensen brothers watched from their shop, their usual gruff expressions softened. Even Dr. Meadows had stepped outside, his eyes shining behind his glasses. They had all known Buddy's story, had all witnessed his unwavering loyalty, but to see it come full circle, to see the family he had waited for finally return, was something none of them would ever forget. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Thompson finally pulled back, her fingers still tangled in Buddy's fur. She looked up at her husband, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Mr. Thompson swallowed hard, glancing at the house, then back at Buddy. "We take him home," he said firmly, "where he belongs." But even as the words left his mouth, Emma felt something shift. Buddy had spent 4 years in Willowbrook. This town had cared for him, watched over him, become part of his story. Could he truly leave it behind? And more than that, did he want to? That night, the Thompsons stayed in town, renting a room at the local inn. Buddy lay curled up beside their bed, as if afraid that if he let them out of his sight, they would disappear again. Emma visited him before heading home, sitting on the floor beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "You did it, Buddy," she whispered. "You finally got them back." His tail thumped against the floor, his eyes half closed, content. But deep down, a question lingered in Emma's heart. Was this really the ending he had been waiting for? The next morning, the town gathered once more as the Thompsons prepared to leave. Buddy stood by their car, his ears twitching as he looked between them and the town that had been his home for so long. Mrs. Callahan wiped her eyes with a tissue, stepping forward to kneel beside him. "You be a good boy, Buddy," she said, stroking his face. "We'll miss you." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat, watching as Buddy took one last look at the abandoned house, the place where he had waited for so long. He turned to her then, pressing his nose against her hand, a silent "thank you." She smiled through her tears. "Go on, Buddy," she whispered. "You've waited long enough." Buddy hesitated for only a moment before jumping into the back seat of the car. The Thompsons waved as they drove off, the car disappearing down the road. The town stood in silence, watching until there was nothing left but dust in the air. Emma wiped at her face, turning away. It was over. He was gone. But as the weeks passed, something didn't feel right. Emma felt it. The town felt it. Even the Thompson family must have felt it. Because 2 months later, when a familiar golden shape came bounding down the street, his tail wagging, his eyes bright with joy, it wasn't just Emma who cried out in surprise. It was the entire town. Buddy had come home. The moment Emma saw Buddy racing toward her, she thought her heart might burst. His golden fur gleamed in the morning sunlight, his paws kicking up small clouds of dust as he charged down the road, his tail wagging so hard it made his whole body sway. For a split second, she thought she might be dreaming. It had been 2 months, 2 long, quiet months since the Thompsons had taken him home. She had spent every day convincing herself that it had been the right thing, that Buddy was where he belonged. But now, as he closed the distance between them, ears perked, eyes locked onto her with undeniable joy. All those thoughts vanished. He leaped into her arms before she could even brace herself, knocking her back slightly as he licked her face, his warm breath mixing with her laughter and the tears already spilling down her cheeks. "Buddy," she gasped, wrapping her arms around him, her fingers sinking into his thick fur. "What? How?" She could barely form a sentence, her mind spinning. She wasn't the only one caught off guard. Around her, the townspeople had begun to gather, their faces reflecting the same mix of shock and joy. Mrs. Callahan stood on the bakery steps, flour still dusted on her apron, her eyes wide. The Jensen brothers poked their heads out from the hardware store, grinning. Even old Dr. Meadows stepped outside, adjusting his glasses as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The moment felt almost surreal. Emma had spent so many days staring at the empty porch where Buddy had once waited, wondering if he had truly found happiness in Greenville. She had pictured him curled up by a warm fireplace, sleeping peacefully at his owner's feet. But now as he nudged against her, his tail thumping wildly against the ground, she knew the truth. He had come back. He had chosen Willowbrook, chosen her. A car pulled up to the curb, tires crunching against the gravel. Emma turned just in time to see Mr. and Mrs. Thompson step out, their expressions filled with exhaustion and something that looked like quiet understanding. They didn't seem surprised to see Buddy here. Not really. Mr. Thompson ran a hand through his graying hair, letting out a long sigh before giving Emma a small, tired smile. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "I guess we should have seen this coming." Mrs. Thompson wiped at her damp cheeks, kneeling beside Buddy, running her fingers through his fur. "We tried," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "We really did. But after a few weeks, he just changed. He barely ate, barely moved. He would just sit by the front door, staring outside, waiting. Every time we took him on a walk, he pulled toward the road like he was trying to get back here. No matter how much love we gave him, no matter how much we tried to make him feel at home, he never stopped looking for this place. For you." Emma swallowed past the lump forming in her throat. She looked down at Buddy, who met her gaze with warm, trusting eyes. She had thought she had done the right thing by reuniting him with his family, but maybe family wasn't just about blood or the past. Maybe it was about where you belonged, where your heart felt at peace. And for Buddy, that place wasn't in a town an hour away. It was here. It was Willowbrook. Mrs. Thompson gave a trembling smile, cupping Buddy's face. "We don't want to take him away from where he's happiest. If that's here, then we have to accept that." She turned to Emma, searching her face carefully before asking, "Would you take him, Emma? Would you give him the home he's been waiting for?" Emma's breath caught. "You mean?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his smile sad but genuine. "He belongs with you." The words settled over her like sunlight breaking through clouds. She had always dreamed of having a dog, but this wasn't just any dog. This was Buddy, the dog who had waited, the dog who had never given up. And now, after all this time, he had found his way home. A choked laugh escaped her, half disbelief, half joy. She wrapped her arms around Buddy's neck, pressing her face into his fur. "Of course I will," she whispered. "Of course." The town erupted into quiet applause, the moment heavy with unspoken emotion. Mrs. Callahan dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron. The Jensen brothers exchanged knowing nods. Dr. Meadows let out a deep sigh, shaking his head with a soft chuckle. "Well," he muttered, "it's about time." Buddy didn't seem to care about any of it. He was too busy wagging his tail, licking Emma's cheek, his whole body vibrating with happiness. He had waited for so long, and now at last, he didn't have to wait anymore. The next few weeks were some of the happiest of Emma's life. Buddy settled into her home as if he had always belonged there, curling up at the foot of her bed at night, trotting alongside her on morning walks through the town. He had a way of bringing people together. Strangers who had once only exchanged polite nods now stopped to scratch behind his ears, to tell Emma how lucky she was. And she was lucky. She knew that. Every time she looked at him, she felt it all over again. One afternoon, she walked past the old Thompson house, now just an empty shell of what once was. She slowed, glancing at Buddy, who looked up at her with calm, steady eyes. For the first time, he didn't stare at the road. He didn't wait. He simply stood beside her, content. Emma reached down, ruffling his fur. "No more waiting, huh, buddy?" He gave a soft huff, nudging his head into her hand before trotting forward. Emma followed, smiling. A few months later, the town held a small ceremony in Buddy's honor. A plaque was placed near the old house, engraved with simple words that held so much meaning. For Buddy, the dog who never gave up, a symbol of love, loyalty, and home. Emma stood beside it, her fingers brushing over the lettering, her heart full. Around her, the townspeople gathered, sharing quiet stories, remembering the dog who had waited for so long. Buddy sat beside her, watching them all, his tail wagging lazily. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft golds and deep purples, Emma knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You did it, Buddy," she whispered. "You found your way home." He leaned into her touch, letting out a soft sigh of contentment. And for the first time in 4 years, Buddy was exactly where he was meant to be.